Hi everyone, it's your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. So, I know you all are probably throwing your hands up in the air asking, where's Dave? Well, let's just say that he's banging his head against a wall, trying ever so hard to get amnesia to clear away the negativity he got from his last video. Oh man, do I certainly know what it's like to have it rough. But in the meantime, I will be filling in to review a game of my own, and what better way to do that than to pick one about yours truly. Neversoft's Spider-Man, a classic in the truest sense. Or is it? But before we boot this bad boy up, I feel the need to give a bit of background concerning my humble conception in order to provide better context for this game. Hopefully this doesn't come across as me trying to adulate myself too much. After all, I've learned a thing or two about the dangers of being irresponsible with my ego since the death of my Uncle Ben. Boy, do I miss him. Anyway, unless you were living under a rock, you'd probably know a thing or two about good old Stan Lee. Well, one day he was sitting in his office and he had an epiphany. There weren't enough teenage superheroes. The sight of a spider crawling up the wall caused a light bulb to go off on his head, and thus I was born. Although, the question of how much credit Stan actually gets is disputed quite a bit. After all, Steve Ditko also played quite a role in my creation, and it doesn't seem to get the same amount of recognition. A feeling that I know all too well concerning how the public hates me, despite all the times I saved it a day. Thanks a lot, Jameson. Sorry, needed to get that off my chest. Eventually, I debuted in Amazing Fantasy number 15. However, I wasn't a god, like Thor, or a super smart detective, like Batman. I was just an ordinary boy from Queens, who got bitten by a spider and lost my uncle to an event I could have easily prevented. Even after becoming Spider-Man, my problems never went away. I had to balance out school and working as a freelance photographer while defending the city from multiple threats. Quite a few girls broke up with me or straight up died because of my double life. And not to mention that I had to take care of my sickly Aunt May. Basically, I was barely scraping by with the good old Parker luck. You wouldn't think that a superhero that was this much of an underdog, no pun intended, would be that popular. But ironically, people fell in love with me for these very aspects. The tragedy that I went through was relatable to so many people, and, not to sound arrogant or anything, I became one of the most popular superheroes in Marvel Comics. If only my personal life was able to match such success. Well, naturally, I started to expand beyond the comic books. I got my own lunchboxes, TV shows, and eventually video games. And while technically I've been around since the Atari, the first actual killer app was Neversoft's Spider-Man, which was for both the PS1 and Sega Dreamcast. Interestingly, these were the same guys that made the Tony Hawk games, so I really have to wonder if that's where my Andrew Garfield self got his skateboarding shtick. Well, this game was the springboard for a whole host of other Spidey-related games, which makes me concerned about how they depicted me in this installment. I mean, for all I know, this could be the equivalent of a propagandic thought piece from J. Jonah Jameson himself. If they skewed my image in this game, then imagine how badly they messed me up in all the other future titles. Then again, there's a 50% chance they did me justice. We'll never know unless we try it out. So, I guess we'll start with the story. Basically, the game begins with Dr. Otto Octavius giving a presentation for a special invention of his, which I, Peter Parker, am taking photos of. All of a sudden, an individual dressed as Spider-Man comes up on the stage and steals Octavius' invention. Funny, considering the last time I checked, I was Spidey. I pretty much get framed for the whole ordeal, and have to clear my name. Not too hard or complex considering that I've busted a Chameleon and Mysterio's asses plenty of times. I've been in these situations before. Except the game gets more complicated when it's revealed that Doc Ock is trying to use Carnage to infest the entirety of New York with symbiotes. So the plot goes from mildly dangerous to really high stakes pretty quickly. And, overall, I quite like that. Basically, this feels like it was taken straight from one of my many adventures as Spider-Man. Generally speaking, I'm not a universally loved hero, so I respect the fact they stayed true to that by making the entire city turn against me as soon as I was accused of being the culprit. Most of my fans expect a good deal of quippage during every battle, and this game delivers on that as well. Seriously, it's a very important part of who I am as a character, and I can't believe that Tobey Maguire's take on me completely left this part out. Like, seriously, while I was watching those movies, I couldn't help but be confused at how little jokes I was making. Maybe Tobey Maguire had a bit of a problem with it. I mean, he doesn't seem like a funny guy to me.
Fuck out of the way! I can't see! There are cars there, motherfucker!
Seriously? Sheesh. Well, maybe he should have taken more notes from Reno Romano, who voices me in this game. Before this, the only other major exposure we had to the way that I sounded was through Christopher Daniel Barnes' portrayal in the 90s show. So, in general, this kind of makes it all the more impressive with how well Romano performs. He brings about this special kind of youthful energy that goes along with my teenage persona I'm often associated with. And, considering the scarce samples of my voice at the time, I have to give props to him. Now, there's one thing that somewhat bothers me, and that's the lack of my Peter Parker side throughout the story. I appear without the mask maybe twice in the game, and arguably the more personal Peter Parker aspect makes up more of my identity than my costumed alter ego. I feel like there could have been at least a little bit of a mention of my personal life, especially considering that my wife Mary Jane features for an albeit brief moment in this game. I guess they didn't want to stuff too much into this game's story. After all, maybe they didn't want to risk the narrative being too convoluted, but it still feels like there's this sort of missing half of me that was left out. But if I'm going to look past that, this is a generally solid depiction of me, all things considered. I'm actually somewhat impressed. In fact, going deeper into the game, I'm actually quite pleased to say that my rogues gallery gets a similar treatment. First, we've got Venom. I've gotta say, there was a time where Venom was probably my most sinister enemy. His number one goal was to kill me, and considering that he pushed me in front of a train, terrorized my wife, and stalked me on multiple occasions, he truly was a threat to behold. However, later on, Venom begins to act as an anti-hero vigilante of sorts, and that seems to be what this depiction of him leans towards. Initially, he kidnaps my wife and tries to mess with me after the whole doppelganger incident, but after realizing my innocence, he starts to work with me and even is humble enough to correct his mistake. In one sense, I'm glad that they went with this kinder, less intimidating version of Venom, because it seems like in every other media, he's misunderstood to simply be this hunky, fearsome monster that's out for blood. I'm sorry, but did they mix up Venom with Carnage? So, it's nice that this game tries to look at the other dimensions of one of my greatest enemies. As much as I don't trust Eddie Brock, it's weird to see so many depictions of him be plain wrong. This game also features quite a few of my B-tier foes. Rhino is bulky and strong, but is kind of an incompetent dumbass, which is definitely in line with his character. Mac Gargan hates my old boss Jameson for leaving him grafted within a scorpion suit. Usually I'm kind of used to him putting up more of a fight, and I was kind of mystified with how many hits Jameson was able to tank from that lethal tail. Well, maybe you could say he was a bit nerfed. In fact, I'd say that they made Mysterio be more of a threat compared to him, and that's really saying something. I mean, kind of similar to what I was saying about Venom, he's kind of been misrepresented throughout other depictions of him. When I played the Spider-Man 2 video game, he goes down in one hit, and I was like, that's it? That's it? There have been other times where Mysterio has proved himself to be more than a shitty magician, like when he tricked Logan into killing all of the X-Men. So to see Neversoft making him a credible threat, by not only having him pose as me to frame me for a crime I didn't commit, but also have him turn into a 50-foot Godzilla that can easily crush me within a couple stomps and punches, is truly appreciated. And forgive me if I'm being a bit lewd, but boy is he thick. Sorry about that. Hopefully I'm not sounding too similar to another guy with a mouth.
You rang?
So generally, these interpretations of me and my foes are not too shabby despite taking certain liberties of its own. I also really quite enjoy how this game presents itself. For instance, every section in the story is segmented off by this comic book cover art, and it almost makes me feel like each level is like a separate issue from a comic series or episode in a TV show, which is very fitting considering the source material I come from. The game even goes out of its way to make a certain hazard part of the story. Sometimes I quite enjoy interacting with the New Yorkers down below, whether it be returning a kid's balloon or just going around as Peter Parker taking photos or spending time with my wife. Sometimes I don't like web swinging all the time, so to restrict me from going to the streets would have upset me if the story hadn't explained that Doc Ock and Carnage had released a certain toxin to prevent the ground from being safe to traverse in. It doesn't make it any less lonely that I'm only able to web swing across buildings, but at the same time, I'm not shaking my fist at the TV screen, questioning, why can't I go on the streets like I could in real life? This feels so limiting. As insignificant as the explanation is, it really shows Neversoft's attention to detail. However, if there was one thing that I took issue regarding this aspect, it's that there aren't any people to save. I guess there are some hostages I rescue in the bank and Daily Bugle, but that's about it. I never get to see how the gas affects the people of New York. This should be like the fucking pandemic. They should be coughing and gagging on this thing. It should have been like what Devil's Breath did in the PS4 game. But no, it just serves as some in-game obstacle. I get much satisfaction with saving people with my Spider-Man powers. It's been one of the major factors in preventing me from out-and-out quitting from being a hero. No matter how hard my life gets, nothing outweighs the joy of protecting people from a threat, and I just don't get to experience that at all except through saving these NPCs that all look the same. And then there's Doc Ock. So, in all my experiences with him, he has shown himself to be one of my most persistent foes. He was the master planner and managed to keep that a secret for a very long time. He was the founder and leader of the original Sinister Six. Hell, the guy was even one of the first villains to take off my mask. In fact, in this game, he probably is at his most threatening. I mean, making a deal with Carnage to control the symbiotes is definitely something that is beyond someone's moral conscience. Granted, I've made a decision that was somewhat similar. However, we don't really get to see him really do anything with this. I've witnessed the symbiotes do a lot of heinous things to other people, like taking over their bodies or even suffocating them. But here, they don't really do much except keep a couple of hostages locked behind symbiote slime. I guess I have very similar comments to make about Black Cat and my wife Mary Jane. Let me just say that Felicia Hardy is a hell of a lot more capable than this game makes her out to be. And the way that she gets benched in the beginning by a blow from Rhino is, dare I say it, a little insulting. Also, how is she somehow okay after that hit? I'd have expected her to have some serious injuries after taking a blow that hard. But no, at one moment, she's wounded being taken away by Octavius and Carnage, who are disguised as paramedics, and the next, she's standing as if nothing happened. What? Did Carnage use his symbiote abilities to heal her? Which, knowing him, is extremely unlikely. As for my wife Mary Jane, well, as much as I hate to put it like this, she probably shouldn't even be in this game. Yeah, she gets kidnapped, but there have been times where she's been able to fight her way out of a situation. Here, after Venom nabs her, she's just dangling from a chain, screaming for me to save her. It makes my fight with Venom all the more insufferable because I have to put up with being manhandled by one of my worst foes while being stressed about my wife's cries for help. But, all that being said, I'd say the story elements are mostly solid. Thankfully, it's not JJ's propaganda. Most of the characters are done really well and are basically recognizable to how I experienced them. At worst, some of the narrative beats are a bit rough, but other than that, I'd rank this as relatively lore accurate. Now, let's move on to the gameplay, shall we? Spider-Man 2000 decides not to implement the free-roaming New York City that I know and love. This is understandable because the hardware simply wasn't up to the task of running something that complex. Even with the lack of an open world, Neversoft still finds a way to make things enjoyable through the level design itself. Nothing ever feels like it's too formulaic, and they all hit me with different challenges that keep things fresh. In the beginning of the game, for instance, I have to stop a bank robbery. Sounds simple enough, except in the middle of the level, I have to defuse a bomb. Considering that I usually think outside of the box to defeat most of my enemies, I tried to figure out ways to safely discard the explosive. Well, I can't throw it out the window. That would probably kill millions of civilians. Taking it to the exit probably won't do much. Eventually, after so many tries, I realized I was overthinking the situation, and, if I had just paid attention, there was a second button for me to press that would have activated the entrance to a vault. Now, of course, having studied chemistry, there are all sorts of questions that I'd like to ask. Like, how can this form of metal withstand the explosion of the bomb? But, at the end of the day, this situation forced me to observe my surroundings and come up with a solution. As simple as it was, logic puzzles always kind of excite me. On the other hand, there's the helicopter chase sequence. These levels actually feel like they're taking full advantage of my powers because they force me to use my agility to the fullest in order to evade the chopper. Honestly, I'm surprised a chopper can keep up with somebody with the speed of a spider. Also, look at how much property damage it's causing. Anyway, this was really intense and kept me engaged. I had no time to breathe and had to just keep running, having nothing except my spider sense to warn me of incoming missiles. As a side note, it isn't rare for law enforcement not to trust me. Again, I do feel like the aspect of how the city perceives Spider-Man after he's been framed could have been explored more beyond this level, so there's some missed potential there. Speaking of powers, the game does go out of its way to really limit me with how capable I am. I don't really get any health upgrades, so I can only take a certain number of hits, and in general, this is quite accurate since my super strength really only goes so far. I know that's a bit emasculating on myself, but I recall the time where I had to lift an entire block of rubble off. Even with my fullest strength, I was barely able to remove it. So despite the fact that the game can get really frustrating with how easily I die in a couple of mob fights, it's in line with reality. That being said, Neversoft provided a way to adapt to this difficulty with my webbing. Whereas my typical melee abilities barely make a dent in some enemies, my web-based attacks actually provide a helping hand. I'm able to fire impact webbing and form force fields that I can burst out for area effect. Even the simple act of tinkling my enemies up slows them down long enough that I can fit in some effective blows. However, my webbing is indefinite. Unlike what the Sam Raimi movies led you to believe, my webbing is limited by the little cartridges from the shooters attached to my wrists. Running out of this fluid doesn't quite render me helpless, except for the times where I'm just free-falling into oblivion. But it does make quite a few situations harder, as my webs are integral to so many things that I do as Spider-Man. Therefore, I have to manage it carefully. So, why am I telling you all this? It's because if there's one thing that Neversoft really got accurate about me, is that since I have a tendency to run out of webbing, it forces a more careful playstyle. And there are many levels that feel as if they're built around these limitations. There's this one part where I have to follow Venom into the sewers, and while the level likes to switch itself up a lot, one thing that remains constant is that it forces me to rely on my webbing most of the time. I'll be flipping switches by firing web strands to solve puzzles involving raising and lowering the water level, doing some precision-based platforming by web-zipping to different pipes, and, well, so much more. However, because I can run out of it, the game makes me solve these puzzles in a cautious yet efficient manner. Sure, I can just refill my webbing with the web cartridges scattered around a level, but still, this concept of limited webbing really makes me think about how to use it so as not to carelessly waste it. On the other hand, Doc Ock's lab tests how much you know about actually using the web techniques. Basically, the ceiling and the floor is covered in electricity, and the only way to get across from point A to B is through these platforms scattered across the room that have lasers attached to them. Now, my web swinging isn't as fluid as it is in reality. In this game, it's really stiff in the sense that you cannot change direction. You have to correctly position my body in front of the platform so that I can swing to that point. I cannot go too far to one side, lest I end up falling to the electrified floor below. All the while, I have to navigate my way through the lasers, which I can destroy with my bare hands. I just have to be careful not to punch too far and accidentally fall off. Maybe it wouldn't have been as frustrating if the web swinging was less stiff and more similar to how I normally do it. However, the added stiffness sort of provides a challenge for the player to focus on their positioning and give more thought with how they approach obstacles like this. And that's something that I really love doing as Spider-Man, figuring out alternate ways to solve a problem. With so many of my enemies, I've learned that I can't brute force my way to defeat them and have to come up with other means to engage them. Sadly, I did not get to re-experience those ingenious moments with this game's boss fights. Yeah, as I kind of already hinted at, the bosses are probably the weakest part of the game. Scorpion is pitifully easy. Just keep hitting him, and when he readies to attack, jump away. Rhino requires a bit more strategy. I like how there are multiple environmental hazards that I can make him run into, like the explosive barrels littered around and the electric fence. However, one thing that struck me as funny is that normally I shouldn't be able to punch through his suit. In fact, when I first faced off against the Rhino, I had to use a special kind of webbing to melt the suit right off of him. It would have been cool if this game had tried to implement something like that, because it would have made the boss fight more creative than what it already is. Venom is kind of like Scorpion, except he has more tricks up his sleeve. You know, I always hated it when Venom was able to turn invisible and stalk me around a city without my spider sense warning me, and Neversoft takes those hated traits and raises them up to 11. Venom will sometimes disappear and reappear in random locations of the arena. However, it's difficult to figure out where he reappears because the camera is such a pain to handle. Not only that, but if I'm too far of a distance from him, he might web yank me closer to him for a cheap shot. Or, sometimes, in the middle of a combo, he might wrap me in his tentacles and drain some of my life. Granted, if I was being honest, there's a part of me that loves being wrapped in his tentacles. This all gets worse when my wife MJ enters the mix. Sometimes Venom will activate different switches that turn on water to drown her, so I have to multitask in fighting Venom while making sure my wife doesn't die. Easier said than done, because most of the time, I'll be struggling to figure out which switch Venom is on. The hit detection is finicky at best, so most of the time, I'll be punching at the switch when I'm just trying to turn it off. And worst of all, Venom has all the same problems from when I last fought him. So that makes this fight in particular a war of attrition. Thankfully, it gets better from here. Mysterio is arguably the best fight in the game because it makes me use a different move, the Impact Web. Basically, I have to shoot down circular terminals located across his body, which forces me to go around to different layers of the building to fire at them. All the while, Mysterio will try to grab, smash, or step on me, depending on which floor I'm on. Which is actually quite hot, if I'm honest. That's not all, though, for there's a second phase that involves Mysterio shooting lasers out of his helmet, while blue electricity comes out of the ground. I found it to be a tad bit unfair how random it was where the electricity came out, but other than that, this fight truly describes how much of a menace Mysterio actually is. Finally, we have Doc Ock and Carnage. These are kind of ho-hum. I'd just have to punch Doc Ock's generator enough to leave him vulnerable so that I could lay a smackdown on him. And Carnage, it was the same. Just punch him enough times into the sonic force field so that the vibrations would weaken him enough to be beaten. Fun fact, from my experiences with Carnage, he's actually immune to sonics. So Neversoft kind of messed up on that one. Oh well, two of the main antagonists that were built up to be this massive threat just went down like they're nothing. Ha! What do you know? Wait, what's this? Wait a minute. The Carnage symbiote is merging with Doc Ock. Holy shit! He's chasing me! Yeah, boy did I fool myself into thinking that was the end of the game. Just when I was about to comment on how anticlimactic that all was, Neversoft had one more trick up their sleeve, and that was Monster Ock. The screeching and screaming as he pursues me terrifies me to the depths of my soul. The only other time I could think of that equates this level of terror is when Green Goblin murdered my girlfriend, Gwen Stacy. Seriously, nothing matches the pulse-pounding dread as Monster Ock races down several corridors while screaming about how he's out for blood. This forced me to learn how to navigate the different floors, and yes, that often led me to dying plenty of times. Seriously, there's almost a cinematic thrill when I started to reach the surface, one that I can only describe as the feeling of finally being free from playing this game. Okay, so overall, I didn't hate it. In fact, I've gotta say I'm impressed how much Neversoft managed to get right about me. Like, this didn't feel like reading one of JJJ's propaganda pieces. But there's only one question I've gotta ask. What do I do next? Yeah, the game was a tad too short for my tastes, and maybe could have been at least an hour longer. Well, you could replay the game to collect the multiple comics of myself scattered across the levels. However, that sounds redundant because I just beat the game. Unless there's a separate mode that makes special changes to the original playthrough. That's right, I learned that if I type in a special code, it unlocks What If mode. As a side note, I learned that if I type in swear words and profanity, a mini version of me pops up on the screen and punches it to a different word, which, as prudish as that is, I find to be cute and funny at the same time. Anyway, What If mode basically makes a bunch of changes that weren't there before. The changes are sadly kind of minimal for the most part, but some of them are a lot of fun. Like that one part in the bank heist where if I enter into a room, I start dancing. Like, what? Who the fuck came up with this? It's cheesy, yes, but it's just so out of left field that it literally had me laughing with the absurdity of it. I guess from time to time I need a break from crime fighting. In another scene, my chase from the police is interrupted by a blimp stationary in the middle of the sky. If I go near it, I'm all of a sudden placed in the middle of a fight against a police chopper while atop a blimp. This basically makes an already intense chase sequence even more intense. Also, Silver Surfer can be seen in the distance. It'd be nice if he bothered to help. Although, my personal favorite of all these changes has to be the fish that swims around in Mysterio's head. I always joked about how Mysterio had a fishbowl for his bubble head, so to see that Neversoft took notes from my witty banters quite pleases me. But yeah, for the most part, these are just small changes at best. They're still lots of fun and makes me want to see what they change next as I go from level to level. The next thing that sort of increases the replay value are these little training room challenges, and these aren't really worth mentioning. The only thing that I'll say is that it's really cool that I was able to find Kraven the Hunter's room when doing the item collecting challenge, which kind of makes me wonder why he got cut. And, of course, you've got these costumes, which can give different abilities if worn. I don't know why, but the Ben Reilly costume just pisses me off. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that Clone Saga is still something I'm resentful of. But having said all of that, am I pleased with how Spider-Man 2000 represented me? I'd say yes. Maybe they took a couple of caveats with certain characters, but other than that, I'm impressed with how true Neversoft stayed to my experience as a Spidey compared to something like the 2002 movie. Sure, maybe my Peter Parker side was missing, and some people, including myself, think that's the heart and soul of Spider-Man. However, if I were to look at it in another angle, the fact they chose to emphasize my costumed alter ego kind of reminded me the sense of fun and escapism I have while being Spider-Man, and that's something that I tend to forget all too often. So many times, I complained about how my Spider-Man half is getting in the way of my personal life, and how I sometimes felt like my life would be better without being a superhero. Well, playing through this game made me realize that while my powers can feel like a curse a lot of the time, they're also a blessing. So, thank you, Neversoft. I never thought you'd help me out like that. With that, Spider-Man 2000 gets 2 web-slingers up.
Hold it right there, Spider-Man. I disavow your view of this game.
Ah, shut the fuck up, Norman. Who cares what you actually think?
Who cares? Who cares? I'm your arch-nemesis. I ruined your life. I took the life of your precious Gwen Stacy. And when you thought you killed me, I came back. And yet, despite my wretched reputation torturing you, I don't even make one appearance in this game.
Well, based on my research, Neversoft did add your lair in one of the levels of the game, and they couldn't use you because of the 2002 movie. Just think for a sec. Most of these villains only show up in a lower-budget video game, but you got to star in this Hollywood movie. What a trade-off.
Silence, you preposterous insect! Actually, I'm an Iraq. Whatever! I detest how I wasn't featured. Not even a name drop. And you're the one who's going to pay. Little Miss Mary Jane Parker is going to get the exact same treatment as your precious Gwen Stacy.
Dude, did you forget how hard I beat you after you killed Gwen?
This symbiote suit augments just about all of my abilities. And do you know how much harder I can tear you limb from limb if you dare hurt my wife? Ah, shit.